The morning mist clung to the Argonne forest like a burial shroud. Somewhere in that gray soup of mud, smoke, and shattered trees, a corporal from Tennessee crouched behind a fallen log, his rifle slick with rain, his boots filled with ice water. Around him the bodies of his comrades lay twisted in the undergrowth, cut down by German machine guns that had erupted from the ridge above. The date was October 8, 1918, and in the next 90 minutes, a man who had tried to avoid this war entirely would become one of the most decorated soldiers in American history. If you are enjoying this story, take a moment to subscribe to the channel and drop a comment telling me where you are watching from. Now, let us continue. His name was Alvin Cullum York. He stood 6 feet tall, with the lean, weathered frame of a man who had spent his life hunting in the mountains. His hands were calloused from farm work and railway labor. His eyes, blue-gray and watchful, had been trained since childhood to spot movement in dense forest cover. But the weapon that would make him legendary that morning was not his rifle. It was a Colt M1911 pistol, a sidearm that many officers considered a last resort, a tool of desperation when everything else had failed. The Germans on that ridge had no idea who they were about to face. They did not know that this quiet, religious man from the backwoods of Tennessee could shoot the eye out of a squirrel at 50 yards. They did not know that he had grown up tracking wild turkeys through terrain so dense that a shot had to be perfect, because there would be no second chance. And they certainly did not know that when 6 of their soldiers would charge him with bayonets fixed, York would calmly draw that pistol and drop them one by one, starting with the man in the rear so the others would not see their comrades fall until it was too late. But before we reach that moment of chaos and blood, we must understand how a pacifist who wrote on his draft card the words, "Don't want to fight," ended up in the middle of the deadliest offensive of the First World War. Alvin York was born on December 13, 1887, in a 2-room log cabin near Pall Mall, Tennessee. The cabin had no electricity, no running water, and barely enough space for the 11 children who would eventually fill it. His father, William York, was a blacksmith and farmer who scratched a living from the rocky Appalachian soil. His mother, Mary, was a devout Protestant who raised her children on scripture and hymns. Young Alvin received only 9 months of formal schooling. His father pulled him out to work the farm, to hunt deer and wild turkey in the surrounding mountains, to help keep the family fed during the brutal Tennessee winters. This lack of education would haunt York later in life, but it gave him something far more valuable for a soldier: the ability to move silently through dense forest, to remain perfectly still for hours while waiting for prey, and to shoot with an accuracy that bordered on supernatural. When his father died in November 1911, Alvin took over as the primary provider for his mother and younger siblings. He found work on the railways at Harriman, Tennessee, where the pay was steady but the hours were brutal. The work changed him. Or perhaps it simply revealed what had always been lurking beneath the surface. York became a hard-drinking, hard-fighting man who spent his wages in saloons and frequently found himself in the local jail after brawls that left men bleeding in the streets. His mother watched her son descend into this darkness with growing despair. She was a pacifist Protestant who believed that violence was a sin against God. She begged him to change, to find redemption, to return to the faith of his childhood. But Alvin ignored her pleas until the night his close friend Everett Delk was beaten to death outside a saloon. Something broke inside York that night. Standing over the body of his friend, he saw the wages of the life he had been living. The violence, the drinking, the brawling, it all led to this: a young man dead in the dirt, his blood mixing with the sawdust and spilled whiskey. York walked away from that scene and never returned to his old ways. He joined the Church of Christ in Christian Union, a fundamentalist sect that forbade drinking, fighting, and most other activities that York had previously enjoyed. The transformation was absolute. The former brawler became a devout believer who spent his evenings reading Scripture and his Sundays singing hymns. He renounced violence entirely, convinced that the Bible commanded him to love his enemies and turn the other cheek. And then, in 1917, the United States entered the First World War. The news hit York like a physical blow. Every man between 21 and 31 years old was required to register for the draft. Those who objected to military service on religious grounds could claim exemption, but they had to explain their beliefs clearly and convincingly. York picked up his pen and wrote 2 words on the exemption form: "Don't want to fight." The claim was denied. Those 3 simple words, written by a man with less than a year of formal education, were not considered a sufficient explanation of his religious beliefs. A more eloquent man might have cited Scripture, might have explained the theological foundations of pacifism, might have convinced the draft board that his faith was genuine, but Alvin York had never learned to express himself with words. He knew how to shoot, how to track, how to survive in the wilderness. He did not know how to argue with bureaucrats. In November 1917, York was sent to Camp Gordon in Georgia to begin his Army training. He was assigned to Company G, 328th Infantry Regiment, 82nd Infantry Division. The other soldiers quickly recognized his skill with a rifle. In target practice, he outshot every man in the company, hitting bullseyes at distances that left the instructors shaking their heads in disbelief. But when they praised him, York's face remained troubled. He still believed that killing was a sin, even in war. His company commander, Captain Edward Danforth, recognized the conflict tearing at York's soul. Danforth was an educated man, a graduate of Georgia Tech, who had studied the Bible extensively. He began a series of conversations with York, quoting passages from Scripture that seemed to condone violence in defense of the innocent. He pointed to the story of David and Goliath, to the conquest of Canaan, to the righteous wars described throughout the Old Testament. York listened, argued, and prayed. The battalion commander, Major George Buxton, joined these discussions, adding his own interpretations of biblical teaching. Together, these officers presented a case that challenged York's understanding of his faith. Was it truly wrong to fight against evil? Was it a sin to protect the innocent from those who would harm them? If a man had the ability to save lives by taking up arms, was he not morally obligated to do so? Buxton eventually sent York home on leave to think it over. For 10 days, the young corporal walked the mountains of Tennessee, reading his Bible and praying for guidance. He climbed to the highest ridges, where the wind cut cold and clean through the pine trees, and asked God to show him the path. When he returned to Camp Gordon, York had made his decision. He would fight. But he would fight not out of hatred or anger, but out of duty to his country and his fellow soldiers. He would trust in God to protect him, and he would do his best to save lives whenever possible, even the lives of his enemies. Take a moment to like this video if you are finding this story compelling. Your support helps bring more hidden histories to light. Now, let us return to the Argonne Forest, where everything York had learned, everything he believed, would be put to the ultimate test. The Meuse-Argonne offensive began on September 26, 1918. It was the largest and most deadly American military operation of the First World War, involving over 1 million American soldiers in a massive push against German defensive lines. The goal was to cut the vital railway lines that supplied German forces along the Western Front, forcing them to retreat or face starvation. York and his unit were thrown into this meat grinder in early October. The fighting was savage. German machine guns had been positioned on every ridge, every hill, every piece of high ground. Each advance cost dozens of American lives. The forests were so dense that soldiers could not see more than a few yards in front of them. Men disappeared into the fog and never returned. The wounded lay where they fell, crying out for help that often never came. On October 8th, York's unit received orders to capture German positions around Hill 223, which controlled a vital section of the Decauville railway line north of Châtel-Chehery. The terrain was a nightmare. Steep slopes covered in dense brush, intersected by ravines that could hide entire companies of enemy soldiers. German machine gun nests had been dug into the hillside at intervals of less than 50 yards, creating overlapping fields of fire that turned every approach into a death trap. York would later describe the opening moments of the assault with characteristic understatement. "The Germans got us, and they got us right smart. Our boys just went down like the long grass before the mowing machine at home." The machine guns were invisible in the fog and forest. The German gunners had positioned themselves perfectly, their weapons zeroed in on the most likely avenues of approach. American soldiers advanced in waves, only to be cut down before they could identify where the fire was coming from. Bodies piled up in the underbrush. The attack stalled, then collapsed entirely as surviving soldiers dove for whatever cover they could find. Sergeant Bernard Early was given command of a patrol consisting of 4 non-commissioned officers, including Corporal York, and 13 privates. Their mission was to work around the German flank, get behind the machine gun positions, and either destroy them or force the gunners to redirect their fire. It was, by any reasonable assessment, a suicide mission. The patrol moved out at dawn, working their way through ravines and dense brush that muffled their footsteps. The fog was so thick that men could only see the soldier directly in front of them. They advanced in single file, rifles ready, hearts pounding with the knowledge that death could come from any direction at any moment. After half an hour of careful movement, the patrol stumbled upon something unexpected: a German battalion headquarters. The enemy soldiers were as surprised as the Americans. A brief firefight erupted, but the Germans quickly realized they were outflanked and outgunned. About 25 prisoners, including several officers, threw down their weapons and surrendered. Sergeant Early ordered his men to secure the prisoners and prepare to withdraw. It should have been a clean extraction, a successful mission that would be celebrated back at headquarters. But the Germans on the ridge above had been watching, and the moment they realized what had happened to their comrades, they turned their machine guns on the small American patrol. The opening burst killed 6 Americans outright. 3 more went down with wounds that would leave them screaming in the mud. Sergeant Early was among the casualties. In the space of a few seconds, Corporal Alvin York found himself the ranking survivor, responsible for 7 unwounded soldiers, 3 wounded men who could not move, and approximately 25 German prisoners who were now just as trapped by the machine gun fire as their captors. York left his squad behind with orders to guard the prisoners and tend to the wounded. Then he moved forward alone, working his way through the underbrush toward the ridge where the machine guns were still firing. He carried his rifle and his Colt pistol, along with about 50 rounds of ammunition. It was not enough. It was nowhere near enough. But it was all he had. The German position on the ridge consisted of approximately 35 machine guns, each manned by a crew of 3 to 4 soldiers. That meant York was advancing against more than 100 enemy combatants, all of whom had the advantage of high ground, fortified positions, and weapons capable of firing hundreds of rounds per minute. A frontal assault would have been instant death. Even a flanking attack by a full company would have been unlikely to succeed without massive casualties. But York did not attack like a soldier. He attacked like a hunter. He found cover behind a fallen tree approximately 25 yards from the nearest machine gun nest. The gunners had not spotted him in the fog and brush. They were focused on the prisoners below, trying to eliminate them before they could be marched away to Allied lines. York raised his rifle, sighted on the nearest German, and fired. The shot was perfect. The German dropped. Before his comrades could react, York had shifted his aim and fired again. Another man fell, then another. The rifle bucked against his shoulder with each pull of the trigger, and each time it bucked, a German soldier died. The remaining machine gunners finally spotted the source of the deadly accurate fire. They swung their weapons toward York's position, but he was already moving, crawling through the underbrush to a new location. By the time the bullets tore through the space where he had been, York was 15 yards to the left, sighting down his rifle at a new target. For the next several minutes, this deadly game continued. York would fire a few shots, relocate before the Germans could zero in on him, then fire again from a new position. His movements were silent and efficient, the product of decades spent hunting in terrain far more challenging than this French forest. The Germans, trained for conventional warfare, had no answer for a single sharpshooter who seemed to appear and disappear like a ghost. At one point, a German officer realized what was happening and ordered a bayonet charge. 6 soldiers fixed their bayonets and charged down the slope toward York's position, screaming as they came. It should have been the end. No man could reload a rifle fast enough to stop 6 charging enemies. But York did not try to reload his rifle. He drew his Colt pistol. Years later, he would explain his technique to reporters. He had learned it hunting wild turkeys in Tennessee. When a flock of turkeys took flight, an inexperienced hunter would shoot the bird in front first. But when that bird fell, the others behind it would see it drop and scatter in panic. A skilled hunter shot the bird in the back of the flock first, then the next one forward, and the next. The birds in front never saw their companions fall and kept flying in a straight line, easy targets. York applied the same principle to the charging Germans. He shot the man in the rear first. The soldier crumpled without a sound. The man in front of him never knew what happened. York shot the next man in line, then the next, then the next. The Germans in front kept charging forward, unaware that their comrades were falling behind them, until suddenly there was only one man left, and he was staring down the barrel of York's pistol. The 6th shot ended the charge. 6 Germans lay dead on the slope between York and the machine gun nests. The remaining defenders stared in disbelief at the carnage. They had just witnessed something that seemed impossible. A single American soldier with a pistol had stopped a bayonet charge cold. First Lieutenant Paul Vollmer, the German officer commanding the position, made a decision. He had already lost more than 24 men to this single American. His ammunition was running low. His soldiers were demoralized. And somewhere in the fog below, more American forces were surely gathering for a full assault. Vollmer walked forward with his hands raised and offered to surrender. York accepted immediately. He had never wanted to eliminate anyone. Throughout the engagement, he had been calling out for the Germans to surrender, begging them to stop fighting so he could stop taking lives. When Vollmer offered the white flag, York felt nothing but relief. The German officer ordered his men to come out of their positions with their hands up. One by one, then in groups, they emerged from their foxholes and machine gun nests. York gathered them together, keeping his rifle trained on the officers, while his surviving squad mates came forward to help manage the growing crowd of prisoners. The march back to American lines took several hours. York placed the German officers at the front of the column, figuring that their own troops would be less likely to fire on them. He was right. Several German units spotted the procession and held their fire, confused by the sight of a huge column of prisoners being escorted by a tiny handful of American soldiers. When York finally reached the Allied command post, the officer on duty stared at the massive column of prisoners with undisguised astonishment. He did a quick count. 132 Germans, including several officers, guarded by 8 exhausted Americans. The brigade commander, upon being informed of the haul, is reported to have said, "Well, York, I hear you have captured the whole German army." York, ever humble, simply replied, "No, sir, I got only 132. Subscribe to the channel now and turn on notifications so you never miss another incredible story from the battlefields of history. Now, let us examine what happened after York emerged from that fog-shrouded forest with more prisoners than most battalions captured in an entire campaign. The military brass moved quickly to recognize York's achievement. He was promoted to sergeant and initially awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, the Army's second highest decoration for valor. But as the full scope of his actions became clear through eyewitness accounts and German interrogations, the award was upgraded to the Medal of Honor, the nation's highest military recognition. The French were equally impressed. They awarded York the Croix de Guerre and the Legion of Honor, decorations that recognized his contribution to the Allied cause. Marshal Ferdinand Foch, the Supreme Commander of Allied forces, personally congratulated York and declared, "What you did was the greatest thing accomplished by any soldier of all the armies of Europe." York returned to the United States as a national hero. Newspapers competed to publish his story. Hollywood producers waived contracts promising enormous sums of money. Advertising agencies begged him to endorse products. Politicians courted him for campaign appearances. In the aftermath of a war that had cost millions of lives and shattered entire nations, America desperately needed a hero, and York fit the role perfectly. But York wanted none of it. He turned down the Hollywood deals, refused the endorsement contracts, and declined the political opportunities. "This uniform ain't for sale," he reportedly told one particularly persistent agent. Instead, he went home to Tennessee. He married Gracie Williams, his longtime sweetheart, and settled down to farm the rocky hillsides where he had grown up. He tried to live a quiet life, far from the spotlight that had briefly illuminated him. It did not work out quite as he planned. The celebrity he tried to avoid kept finding him. Reporters showed up at his farm. Veterans wrote him letters by the thousands. Schools and civic organizations invited him to speak about his experiences. York accommodated as many of these requests as he could, always emphasizing that the credit belonged to God, not to him. But the attention came with costs. York's lack of business experience left him vulnerable to schemes and swindles. By 1921, he was deeply in debt, despite the fame that should have guaranteed his financial security. Several well-meaning public campaigns to raise money for him fell flat or were mismanaged. York responded to these difficulties by channeling his energy into causes he believed in. He founded the Alvin C. York Foundation, dedicated to improving educational opportunities for children in rural Tennessee. He remembered his own 9 months of schooling, remembered how that lack of education had nearly prevented him from properly explaining his conscientious objection to the draft board. He was determined that other children from poor families would not face the same barriers. In 1926, York established the Alvin C. York Agricultural Institute, a school that provided education to rural Tennessee students who otherwise would have had no opportunity to learn. The school accepted students regardless of their ability to pay, funded largely by York's celebrity and the donations it attracted. It continues to operate to this day, a lasting legacy of a man who never finished his own education. When the Second World War began, York tried to re-enlist. He was over 50 years old, overweight, and in declining health, but he still felt the call of duty. The Army rejected his application for combat service but commissioned him as a major in the Signal Corps, where he could contribute without facing the physical demands of infantry warfare. York spent the remaining years of his life on his Tennessee farm, surrounded by his wife and 8 children. He suffered from declining health, including a stroke in 1954, that left him bedridden for the last decade of his life. On September 2, 1964, at the age of 76, Alvin Cullum York passed away in Nashville. His funeral was attended by thousands of mourners, including veterans who had served with him and politicians who recognized his contribution to American history. He was buried with full military honors in Pall Mall, Tennessee, not far from the log cabin where he had been born almost 8 decades earlier. The story of Alvin York resonates across the decades because it represents something fundamental about the nature of heroism. He did not seek glory. He did not want to fight. He was a man of deep faith who genuinely believed that violence was wrong and who struggled mightily with the moral implications of what he was asked to do. When he finally accepted his duty, he did so with reluctance and continued to call for his enemies to surrender, even as he fired upon them. His skill with a rifle and pistol was undeniable, honed through years of hunting in the Tennessee wilderness. But what made him exceptional was not just his marksmanship. It was his calm under pressure, his ability to think tactically while bullets whipped past his head, his refusal to panic even when facing impossible odds. These qualities, combined with his physical abilities, transformed an ordinary corporal into a one-man army. The German soldiers who surrendered that day in the Argonne Forest had every advantage: superior numbers, fortified positions, automatic weapons, high ground. They lost because they faced an enemy unlike any they had been trained to fight. York moved like a ghost through the underbrush, appearing where they least expected him, striking with deadly accuracy, then vanishing before they could respond. He fought like a hunter, not a soldier. And that made all the difference. There were other heroes in the First World War who accomplished similar feats of individual bravery. Wilfred Wood, a British private, single-handedly captured more than 300 Austro-Hungarian soldiers at the Battle of Vittorio Veneto using a Lewis gun and raw courage. Many other soldiers whose names have been lost to history performed acts of valor that went unrecognized and unrewarded. War produces heroes in abundance. Most of them never receive the recognition they deserve. What set York apart was partly luck, partly circumstance, and partly his unique combination of skills. He happened to be in the right place at the right time with the right abilities, but he also made choices that other men might not have made. He chose to advance alone against overwhelming odds. He chose to keep fighting even after most of his squad had been eliminated. He chose to accept a surrender rather than continue the slaughter. These choices defined his character as much as his famous marksmanship. In the decades since York's death, his story has been told and retold in books, films, and documentaries. The 1941 film Sergeant York, starring Gary Cooper, became one of the highest-grossing movies of its era and introduced York's story to millions of Americans who had been too young to remember the First World War. The film took some liberties with the historical record, but it captured the essential truth of York's character, a humble, deeply religious man who became an unlikely warrior. Military historians continue to study York's actions in the Argonne Forest as an example of individual initiative and tactical flexibility. His technique of shooting charging enemies from back to front, derived from his turkey hunting experience, has been taught in military training programs. His ability to use terrain and concealment to neutralize a superior force has been analyzed in tactical manuals. But perhaps the most enduring lesson of York's story is simpler than any tactical principle. It is a lesson about the power of one person to make a difference, even against impossible odds. On that foggy morning in October 1918, Alvin York was just one man with a rifle and a pistol, facing more than 100 enemies dug into fortified positions. By any reasonable calculation, he should have died in that forest. He did not die. He won. And in winning, he saved the lives of his squad mates, captured over 100 prisoners who might otherwise have continued fighting, and helped break the German defensive line that had been holding up the entire American advance. One man, one rifle, one pistol, and 90 minutes of calm, methodical violence changed the course of a battle. Take a moment to think about that the next time you face a challenge that seems insurmountable. The odds were against Alvin York in ways that most of us will never experience. He had every reason to despair, to surrender, to accept defeat. Instead, he drew his pistol and went to work. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, and leave a comment sharing your thoughts. What other stories of individual heroism would you like to hear about? Your feedback helps shape the content of this channel. Until next time, remember that history is not just about nations and armies. It is about individuals, ordinary people, who found themselves in extraordinary circumstances and rose to meet the challenge. Alvin York was one such individual. There are countless others waiting to have their stories told.